Well, good day to you, everyone, no matter where you happen to be around the world. This is Mike Fitz with Explore.org, the world's largest live nature cam network. I'm the resident naturalist with Explore.org. I'm also a former park ranger at Katmai National Park, Alaska. So that's where I first got to know the brown bears and salmon that we see on the cameras, and I'm very grateful for Explore.org for giving me the opportunity to continue to share this experience with everyone. This is a live broadcast, so we don't really know what we're going to see or what we are going to talk about during every moment. I'm also my own producer, so I will be switching in between different camera views from time to time. So it's not uncommon for you at home or wherever you happen to be watching and listening from to hear pauses when I'm thinking about what to talk about next, looking at the different camera feeds to transition to different areas along the river. I have a couple of wonderful camera operators who are also working behind the scenes to give you the best views of the bears on the river. So we not only can look at the bears at Brooks Falls, but we can go downriver, like to the lower river cameras. The River Watch camera is in view right now. We can go across the river, directly across the river from that one to look more towards the mouth of Brooks River. Wonderful fall colors, peak fall colors it looks like right now happening in Katmai. I brought online the just a static view of another lower river camera, so we actually have 3 at our disposal there. And then of course we can go underwater every once in a while, and we can't talk about bears at Brooks River without talking about the salmon that happen to be feeding them. So definitely a lot of things to talk about today. And of course, before we get to our bears, I want to introduce and invite you to participate in a few different in the bear cam experience in a few different ways. If you're signed in with Explore.org and use the snapshot tool, I invite you to participate in the community science project. You'll see a button when you take your snapshot. If you click that button, it'll take you to a different link where you can answer just a few simple questions about what is in your photo. You just need to know how many bears are in the photo and what other species you might see. If it's a bird, or if you saw different birds, or you saw salmon, a human, anything like that, you can note that in those questions. This helps us to keep track of the relative amount of bear activity at Brooks River while the cameras are live, because there are so many more people watching the bear cams than there are people watching the bears at Brooks River, especially at this time of the year. So I invite you to participate in that. Of course, if you have questions for me that you want answered in advance, please go down to the Bearcam question form. You can find a link to that below the live camera feed in the more information tab. You can post your question there. I have several questions from that form that I'll try to answer during the chat today. And so if you have more questions for me, I can take a look at those and try to answer those through the Bearcam question form. And then I'm also very excited that coming up in just a couple of days is Fat Bear Week. It starts on Wednesday, October 2nd. It concludes on Fat Bear Tuesday, October 8th. You can join Ranger Naomi and I for a special live chat at 11 a.m. on Wednesday to launch Fat Bear Week. Fat Bear Week is an opportunity for you to choose who you think is the fattest bear cam bear of 2019. And on Wednesday, there are a couple of different matchups: 775 Lefty versus 480 Otis, and 854 Divot versus number 402. So I'm looking forward to this. Go to Katmai National Park's Facebook page to participate in the contest. You vote with your likes or reactions. The bear with the most reactions or likes moves on to the next round until there's only one fat bear standing. So make sure that when you are weighing who to vote for so to speak, that you make your campaign posters, you share your bear's platform in the comments. I think it's a really fun way to participate in the contest and debate the merits of who you think is the fattest bear can bear. And there's a lot of different ways to measure that, and I'm not going to say there's just one way to do it. If you want to learn more about the fat bears in Fat Bear Week, you can also download the Bears of Brooks River 2019 book in the more find the link to that in the more info tab, again below the live camera feed. And that book also contains a lot of information about some of the individual bears that I will be talking about during the broadcast today. Many of you aren't familiar with the location of Brooks Falls, though. Maybe you're tuning in for the first time and you're wondering just where this place happens to be. Well, let me take you on a quick tour to familiarize yourself, or everyone, with this location. Brooks River is located about 300 miles southwest of Anchorage, Alaska, in the west central portion of Katmai National Park. The river is about 1.5 miles long, and in this view, it flows from left to right. Brooks Falls is located at about the river's halfway mark. Explore.org hosts and maintains several webcams along the river, and the signal from the bear cams is relayed to not one but two repeaters on Dumpling Mountain, which then relay the signal to the small town of King Salmon about 30 miles away. It's a challenge to maintain these cameras and get the feed out to everybody across the world, but everyone at Explore.org is up to the task, and we're glad that you enjoy the cameras as much as we do. Right now, we're looking at a small, relatively small bear in the jacuzzi, which is the plunge pool below Brooks Falls. We've been seeing a lot of bears moving in and out of the waterfall area today. And last night I was watching the cameras in the evening before they went offline when it got dark, and there were 6 to 8 bears fishing at Brooks Falls. So really still a lot of activity happening at the waterfall right now. Almost numbers that we would see in July, which is usually the peak of bear activity at Brooks Falls. There have been many adult bears fishing in the far pool. This bear that we see in the jacuzzi, that plunge pool below the falls, appears to be what we call a sub-adult bear. So that's a bear that is independent of its mother, but not quite fully mature. So they're like the teenagers of the bear world. They're still going through a lot of learning experiences, trying to learn how to fish at the falls, facing a lot of competition from larger bears. You can see that one, it looked like that one that was in the jacuzzi kind of preemptively moved out of the way because it probably saw this other bear charging into the water looking to fish. The jacuzzi is actually somewhat of a difficult place for small bears to fish, just because the water really wants to push you and force you out of that location. So you see the larger bears make it look easy, but the smaller bears really have a much harder time making a living in that spot. While there are not a lot of adult bears at the falls right now, again, this is an important opportunity for these younger bears to test their skills and gain more experience fishing in these locations that otherwise wouldn't necessarily be accessible to them. It's not uncommon to see bears like this one patrolling the fringes of the waterfall, though, looking really for anything that can't swim away. The river right now is really just loaded with spawning salmon, and even where this bear is walking right now, it's hard to see through the glare of the water, but salmon are scattering in a variety of different directions as this bear moves forward. You can see the bears, this one is not working very hard, not chasing not chasing fish, not expending any extra energy. And that's because they don't need to chase the more vigorous salmon, because they can find dead salmon throughout the river right now, and they're not shy about scavenging dead fish. And in fact, that is what's happening at the mouth of the river right now. When you see bears snorkeling and swimming out on the lake, they're really just looking for anything on the bottom that can't swim away. As salmon re-enter fresh water, they stop eating. So they are, they only reproduce once in their lives before they die. So they come in the fresh water, they stop eating, they migrate, they spawn, and they die. And that is a life history strategy that biologists call semelparous. It's actually fairly uncommon, really, among mammals. I think there's maybe a couple of species of rodents that do it. It's fairly common in insects. I mean, there's a lot of different insect species that only reproduce once in their lifetime before they die. They have very short lifespans. But salmon, are relatively long-lived compared to some fish species. And the sockeye salmon that we have spawning in Brooks River are generally anywhere from 3 to 5 years old when they spawn. But they only come back into fresh water once before they spawn and die. And as those fish lose their energy, they begin to die, they drift downstream, and they collect in the eddies, the side channels, the different slow-moving areas of the lower river. And it makes easy pickings for any of the bears that want to move through the water and scavenge those fish. And they can pick up dozens of dead and dying fish at this time of the year. This is actually the peak of bear activity at Brooks River for the fall season, because it coincides with the peak availability of salmon in late summer and fall. September really is the month of the year where salmon spawn in the greatest numbers in Brooks River. So consequently, we see more bears here in September than we see in October, or especially in August. So lots of activity happening right now. As the salmon run sort of plays out for the year, as the majority of the fish spawn and die, bears will continue to scavenge for those fish as much as they can. But then they'll begin to disperse away from Brooks River fairly soon. Generally by, the middle of October, there are far fewer bears at the river compared to what we see right now. And these bears that we're looking at on the lower river are just practicing a classic and efficient foraging strategy to pick up those dead and dying salmon at the river mouth and in the lower river. So we call this behavior snorkeling. They're not breathing underwater, of course. They're just sticking their faces in the water, looking for anything that can't swim away. And for whatever reason, when you see bears do this, they almost never get their ears wet. I don't know why. Maybe they just don't seem to like it. Maybe they like to be able to hear what's going on around them. Maybe it's just uncomfortable for them. But very, very few bears will actually dive for salmon. If they see a bear on the bottom, they will try to pick it up, with their feet. But most of them are fairly loath to get their heads wet, or completely wet. Now, when these bears are moving through the lower river area, of course, they're seeing, just like some of the bears at the falls, they see a lot of vigorous salmon there, but they're not chasing those fish. Again, they're looking for the ones that are easy to catch, because there are so many escape routes for these salmon at the mouth of Brooks River. It really is not worth the bear's while to chase these fish. And bears are really very efficient in their foraging strategies. You have to be when you need to eat a year's worth of food in 6 months or less. And this is a live view from the lower Brooks River. So this is our underwater camera one of my favorite views of the river. The majority of the fish that you're seeing in the water right now are sockeye salmon. So they're fairly easy to identify at this time of the year. Green heads, bright red bodies. From time to time, we'll also see some coho or silver, sometimes called silver salmon, move into the frame. And I think there's one just at the lower left that hasn't quite come up to the camera's view yet. But they have green backs with spots on them and pinkish sides. So they look much different than the sockeye salmon. The silver salmon are a bit larger than the sockeyes. Sockeyes are about 4 to 8 pounds on average. The silver salmon can be anywhere from 8 to 12 pounds on average, sometimes much, much larger than that. And they also arrive a little bit later in the summer compared to the sockeye. So for a bear, especially if you're one of the bears that is fishing Upper Brooks Falls, if you catch a silver salmon, that can actually be a great reward in calories. So a couple of bears, again, being very patient. It's one of the characteristics that we see in almost all brown bears that we're watching at Brooks Falls, that characteristic of patience. Once they know that waiting can be rewarding, they'll do it repeatedly, sometimes for hours. And sitting in the water like this really doesn't expend any extra energy compared to, being out in the forest, wandering around, or even laying down. Bears are very tolerant of cold water. It's, as you can see on some of the lower river cameras, you can see that there's a lot of rain and drizzle. It's not a very warm day up there. The water is fairly chilly. It's probably in the 50s right now, but bears don't seem to mind. They're very massive animals. They have a lot of body fat on them, a lot of fur that helps to keep them insulated. So they are much more tolerant of cold water than a human would be. Most of the fish that we were looking at before on the underwater camera have not yet spawned. Every once in a while you'll see a spawned out fish sort of drift by. You can often identify them by their worn looking features, yellowish tails where they've worn their tail down digging nests or fighting with other fish as other fish bite their tails. So these fish will move upstream over the next few weeks, spawn mostly in the lower portions of Brooks River. Every once in a while, some will try to jump the falls, and a good look at some coho and silver salmon moving into the frame right now. But most of these fish have decided, hey, the lower river is where I need to be. That's where I was born. Salmon have a very precise homing mechanism to find the same place in the same river where they were born. After they hatch and they migrate up into the water column, and then eventually as they migrate out to sea, they imprint on the unique chemical signatures of the water that they pass through. And it basically allows them to form a mental map. And that's how they find their way back into fresh water. So just beautiful fish. This is, again, they are the keystone of Katmai's ecosystem. The whole reason why bears are fishing at Brooks Falls and at Brooks River, and why we can watch bears in large numbers at Brooks River itself. And if you want to know, why the bears are doing what they're doing at the river, again, it's really probably the best, I guess, maybe the best avenue to try to explore this dynamic. Again, answering the question, why are bears doing what they're doing, is just to think about what are the salmon doing, because Brooks River is such an important place for bears to fish. Earlier in the year, in late June and July, Brooks River is the first place in the region where bears can fish for salmon. Salmon arrive here fairly early in July and late June. And Brooks Falls creates a temporary barrier to those migrating salmon. And those salmon are especially valuable in calories at that time of the year. And the average sockeye salmon contains about 4,500 calories per fish. So when we see a bear like Otis, for example, catching and eating a dozen fish a day, I mean, he's taking in tens of thousands of calories during that time of the year, a time of the year where they really don't have a lot of other options for nutritious food. That's not what's happening in the river right now, though. In the river right now, the salmon are spawning. This is really what Brooks River looks like throughout almost its entire stretch, its whole 1.5 mile stretch. At this time of the year, salmon competing for nesting sites, digging nests. The males compete for access to females. The females, though, they are the ones that dig the nests. So they fan the gravel with their tail. This footage was actually taken in the riffles just below, about 100 yards downstream of the falls. But this is it for them. They come here to do one thing and one thing only, and that's to spawn and to die. Again, salmon are not only anadromous, but they are also semiparous, meaning that they spawn just once in their lifetimes and then they die. Anadromy means that they're born in fresh water, they go to salt water to grow large, and then they come back in the fresh water to spawn. And these salmon sacrifice so much in order to reproduce, not only their lives, but before they die, their bodies as well. The female salmon doesn't have any tools to dig nests with, so they use their tails, they wear their tails down to almost nothing. But like I was mentioning before, that doesn't mean that the bears aren't eager to eat these dead and dying fish. They may contain fewer calories than a salmon fresh from the ocean, but it's very easy for bears to go through the river right now and catch any of these, look for any of these dead and dying salmon that just happen to be on the bottom of the river. And I'm going to try to pay attention a lot to the lower river cameras today, just because this is probably the last day that we'll have, last full day at least, that we'll have the lower river cameras. The lower river cameras are powered by generators that also power Brooks Lodge, the Brooks Camp Visitor Center. This is, not necessarily a wilderness location. This year, over 14,000 people visited Brooks River, which I think is a record number. I don't think the river has ever experienced that many people in a year before. But the lodge is shuttered for the year. It's shut down. It shuts down on September 18th. Yeah, it shuts down on September 18th. So right now there's not a reason really to run these giant diesel generators, and they're not small generators either. They're huge. I don't have a photo of them. I was looking for a photo that I could share with you, but they burn a lot of energy. So in the future, Explore.org is going to work with Katmai National Park to try to keep the lower river cameras online longer, perhaps through some clean energy alternatives to diesel, like solar panels or methanol fuel cells. The park's long-term plan is to connect the generators that continue to run on the for the park housing area on the opposite side of the river from Brooks Lodge. And if that happens, then we'll be able to have the lower river cameras on much longer in the season, because that generator runs as long as staff are at Brooks River winterizing the facilities. So again, another example of a bear being efficient with his movements, looking for anything that can't swim away. And when we watch these bears in the lower river right now, we have an opportunity to see them well on the cameras. They stay in our line of sight. If we get good views of them, we can count how many fish they're catching and eating. If we get a really good view of them, we can get a sense of the number of calories they might be intaking by estimating the amount of the whole fish that it's eating. Some of my observations when I've been at Brooks River in September watching bears for an extended period of time at the mouth of the river, my observations indicate that it's not uncommon for bears to catch, even within a half hour, or scavenge, I should say, 2 dozen or more spawned out salmon. And again, they might not be the very energy-rich salmon that they catch earlier in the summer. But again, even if that each one of those fish contains just something like 2,000 calories or 1,500 calories, you're catching, and consuming 24 of those in an hour. I mean, that's a tremendous amount of food. Excuse me. And at this time of the year, bears are still gaining several pounds of weight per day. I mean, their weight gain is really incredible. They're going through a process called hyperphagia, and it really where they're experiencing hunger in a way humans normally do not. Their bodies have really suppressed the ability to feel full like we do after a big meal. And I think if you've experienced that before, you've eaten a really big meal in a short amount of time, your stomach says, hey, that's enough. You really can't take any more. But the hormone that is released during that process, which is called leptin, is actually suppressed in hyperphagic brown bears at this time of the year. So they really never get that feeling of fullness like we do, and they just continue to eat and eat and eat. And that's an adaptation that allows them to really prepare for upcoming winter hibernation, because they are going to subsist this winter on nothing but their fat reserves. When they go into their dens, they don't eat, they don't drink, they don't urinate, they don't defecate. So it's really an amazing feat of mammalian adaptation. Really, no other animal survives winter in quite the same way. There are a lot of other mammal hibernators, but those animals wake up periodically to urinate or defecate, sometimes even eat, depending on the species. Brown bears don't do that, though. They may be fairly conscious. Their body temperature only drops a few degrees centigrade, so they don't really enter the deep state of hypothermia that a ground squirrel does, for example. But they still possess a lot of remarkable hibernative adaptations. And they'll come out of the den with being a lot skinnier because they've burned a lot of fat reserves, but their muscle mass remains largely intact. Their bone health remains largely intact. If a human were to be put in the same situation, we would not fare well. So brown bears may offer us opportunities to learn more about how they prevent diseases like disuse osteoporosis or muscle loss for somebody who suffers a traumatic injury and who is bedridden and can't exercise. And that's sometimes one of the things that I think about when I'm watching these animals. It's just how they do survive their wintertime environment. And scientists and biologists are gaining more and more insight on that each year, but a lot of those processes are still largely mysterious. But also, as part of this hyperphagia process, this gorging that they do at this time of the year, they also get sleepy. The transition to hibernation is not necessarily a switch. It's not like flipping a switch on and off like we do for our light bulbs. It's a long, slow transition that happens over several weeks. And bears at this time of the year are probably undergoing that process right now, where their heart rate slows down, their body temperature starts to fluctuate, starts to drop slightly. They also tend to get overheated very easily because they're carrying a lot of fat reserves at this time of the year. But when biologists have attached, heart monitors, for example, to brown bears, to wild brown bears, to try to figure out what is happening to their bodies in the time period before hibernation and during hibernation, they found that it is a long, slow process into this hibernation metabolism that they undergo. So when we see a bear in the fall that's sleeping a lot, it's not being lazy. It's maybe undergoing that transition as we watch it. So now as we take a look into the far pool here, you can see a bear moving around, trying to catch salmon. The water in the far pool right now is quite high. The water level in the river overall has gone up significantly over the last several weeks. If you were watching the bear cams in the middle of August and late August, you would have seen much less water flowing over the falls. But it seems like September at Brooks River has been very wet, and that has increased, of course, the amount of water running through the river. It's good for the salmon. It allows them to access their spawning sites easier. It allows them to avoid the bears maybe just a little bit easier. For bears fishing at the falls, though, that extra water makes it a little bit harder for them to catch their fish. It looks like maybe we're looking at number 151 Walker in the foreground here. I can't quite see who's behind him. Walker's an adult male who is in his early teens. I think he was first identified in 2008 or 2009 as a young bear at the time. I recognize him by his pointed, narrow and tapering muzzle, so it kind of comes to a point. He has fairly wide set ears, dark coat overall at this time of the year, and generally lacks scars or wounds that we see a lot on a lot of other adult males. He's actually gotten quite fat over the last year, and he is one of those Fat Bear Week candidates. So he's grown significantly since last year. Just observing him in person and on the cameras and comparing some of my photographs from this year and last year, yeah, he definitely looks like he is a much bigger bear. And male bears will start to really slow down in their overall growth rate once they reach their, I guess their early teens. Sometimes it happens earlier, around 10 years of age. Their skulls really don't reach, within, a few percentage points of its maximum size until a male brown bear is around, 9 or 10 years old or so. And, length and height, generally they kind of reach, within a few percentage points of their maximum length and height during that age too. But their body mass, especially in areas where they can access a lot of food, continues to just grow throughout their teenage years, as long as they stay healthy, like they don't, suffer from a significant injury or disease. And the bear, actually, now I'm getting a better look at the bear behind him. It looks like number 68 sitting in that far pool. And he is a very large adult male brown bear. If he ever gets out of the water, maybe we'll get an opportunity just to get a look at how massive he actually is. But he's one of the larger and more dominant bears that we have seen on the river this year. And both of these bears are fishing in the far pool, looking for some of those fresher fish that are remaining in the area who might swim by. Of course, they're using their eyeballs to try to locate those fish, but also in the far pool, with all of the foam in the water and all the air in the water, they're using their quickness and their reactions to try to catch the fish there. And in fact, I can give you a perspective on the far pool, what it might look like from a bear's view. If you're entering the river from the far side, which is where a lot of bears come down to the river, there's a muddy path on that side that they tend to use. This is the view that you would get a look at. So Walker right now, again, fishing near the boulders. Number 68 in our camera view would be just out of our line of sight if we were looking at the far pool from this photograph. And this photograph was taken when the water level in the river was, I think, just a little bit lower than what we see right now. So the bears are contending with a little bit more water in the river right now. But they're so strong, the high water in the river doesn't seem to bother them very much. And again, that's another one of the ways that I marvel at them. It's basically just due to their strength. When I've tried to walk around Brooks Falls, especially when the water level is high, it's very difficult for me to do. But I also lack the mass of a brown bear, the strength of a brown bear, and sort of like their four-wheel drive. So those big claws with those big paws It really does help them to navigate these waters very easily. But again, that's another way that we can admire them, is because they possess so much strength and they can move through the water so easily. It's a very difficult proposition to do on 2 feet. And I know our camera operators are following a bear downstream. Let's go down there to see what it might be up to. And again, snorkeling, looking for anything that can't swim away. We will see bears at this time of the year chase fish, and I think we just got maybe a slight view of that bear lunging after a salmon. Again, they definitely do want to try and eat fresher fish if they can. Maybe we'll get a better view of it if I switch to our static view from another lower river camera, so we can see that bear towards the upper right-hand side of the screen. Investigating, again, the edges of the grassy islands, that's a place where bears frequently go at this time of the year. They know that salmon get caught in those places. They can't swim away because their energy is they're just so exhausted from spawning and being in fresh water for several weeks without eating. So bears will use that area, or have learned that those areas contain dead and dying fish. So they will frequently sort of circumnavigate these islands looking for those dead and dying salmon. The island downstream of the bridge at Brooks River, this is what we call it, the Downriver Island. Simple name, a classic name. That's another place where dead and dying salmon get caught frequently. This is, of course, a time of the year of rapid transition at Brooks River. Summer is clearly transitioned into fall. There's already snow on the mountains. The fall colors, again, at their peak. So a really beautiful scene at the river right now. And this is really one of my favorite times of the year at Brooks River. I've had the opportunity to spend some time there in late September and October, and it is really a wonderful season. But staff are still at Brooks River. Rangers and other park staff are still at Brooks River. And they are participating in a variety of tasks. Shutting down, winterizing the camp. And that is a topic that I did want to discuss during the broadcast today. Because during September, the number of bears in the lower Brooks River is actually quite high. So there are bears walking through the camp area frequently. This is a video that I took from the porch of the Brooks Camp Visitor Center. You're looking towards Brooks Lodge and the Brooks Lodge cabins. That's 151 Walker from a couple years ago walking through the camp area. So rangers, are still keeping an eye on the buildings. Maybe not actively hazing the bears away at this time of the year because there are less people around. But one of the reasons why there are so many park staff situated around Brooks Lodge is not just because we talk to people there. It's because, we need to protect the buildings and the equipment from bears. Bears are very curious animals. They love to investigate anything that happens to be strange and novel in their environment. They'll chew on car bumpers, which is what you're looking at right here. Just some tooth marks in a car bumper. Especially in the fall after, there are fewer people walking around. When bears, or if bears are less likely to get chased out of camp, they sort of remember that. They're maybe more likely to investigate different things. Every once in a while, they'll dig underneath a building. This is an old tent frame. It has since been removed, thankfully, because it was actually sort of a terrible design for somebody trying to live and work in bear country. This is a tent frame that rangers stayed in And you can see at the bottom of that tent frame, that excavation is from a brown bear. This tent frame actually had its wastewater drained directly into the ground. It was supposed to be a temporary feature, and it just became permanent. Sometimes, as things go that way, and it was very smelly. The electric fence generally kept the bears away. You can see those wires at the corner of the building. That's part of an electrical fence system to keep bears away. But when there aren't a lot of people around Brooks Camp, especially in the fall, bears become a bit more bold and more willing to express their curiosity towards these different buildings. Of course, not only the park housing areas, but also the sewer lines that run under the ground. They will dig those up from time to time too. So each year after when staff returns to Brooks Camp, they really have to look for maybe damage that needs to be repaired, because bears will damage some of the facilities. Electric fences are one ways that that park staff use to deter bears from investigating the buildings. The Brooks Lodge staff puts an electric fence completely around the lodge itself. That's really not feasible for all the other buildings at Brooks Camp. There's just too many of them. So in a way, having this stuff happen is the cost of doing business in an area where you have some of the highest densities of bears in the world. Electric fences are an important way to keep bears away. There can also be other, I don't know if I necessarily want to call it passive ways to keep bears away, but you can in places where bears are likely to walk or start to dig up, for instance, you can, park staff will place boards that have nails sticking out of them on the ground. And it's not like bears run over these. I don't want you to get the impression that, a bear has to experience the nails in a painful way to understand that's not something to step on. Bears are smart. They see that. They can feel it. They might investigate a little bit with their paws, but they understand that this is something to stay away from. So these are bear boards, and they're used quite frequently in areas like Brooks Camp, where bears are likely to walk into places or walk on top of things that people would rather not have them investigate. And the story behind this particular photo, this is an area near the corner. It's actually the opposite side of the river from where we're looking at this bear right now. So just behind it, that rocky bank, through the woods, you follow the path that's there that takes you to this location. This is where the original Brooks Lodge used to be. This is where it was established in 1950. And there's still some things in the ground there from the original lodge, and also areas where there could be fuel scents and diesel fuel lingering in the ground. So every once in a while, bears will dig some of those things up. And to try to mitigate, what they're doing there, sometimes you have to put electric fences around things or use bear boards. As part of the winterization process that's happening at Brooks River right now too, you'll see the park's large landing craft, the Kitterick, moving back and forth. Kitterick is an Alutiiq word that means basically sheltered cove or sheltered waters, if I remember the translation correctly. And that was, that's the native name for Brooks River. This boat, this landing craft, will be moving back and forth quite frequently. You'll see it, and then at the end of the year, one of the last things that the park maintenance staff does is that they push it, or they beach it right at the shore, and then it becomes slowly exposed as the water level in the lake drops over the wintertime. So high water in the river and in the lake right now. So the park's landing craft can access a lot of different areas, but come springtime, it's often high and dry. We still have, of course, our bear in the mouth of the Brooks River. It looks like a great view of several bears up at Brooks Falls itself. And if you're tuning in, partway through the broadcast, Glad you could join me today. My name is Mike Fitz, your resident naturalist with Explore.org. I have some wonderful camera operators working behind the scenes to give us these views of the brown bears at Brooks River right now. This is a play-by-play style broadcast, so I'm doing my best to narrate the bear and salmon activity that we see at Brooks River to give you some insight into their lives and how they survive in this landscape. We've been seeing, over the last decade or so, an increasing number of bears using the falls in September. And again, I wonder if this is part of a long-term trend where bears are just learning, hey, we can still make a living here. We don't have to necessarily scavenge for fish downstream. The catch rate, though, at the falls is far less than what we have towards the river mouth. So again, bears are, they're making a decision, trying to decide, how am I going to best make a living? Is it worth my while to go to the waterfall and wait for fish to come to me, maybe get access to not as many fish, but eat fish that have more energy in their bodies? Or do I want to try to make a living downstream, moving through the river area? One place that we haven't looked at yet today is the riffles. Scavenging fish in this area, and especially, of course, scavenging fish down at the mouth of Brooks River. And I think right now we might have a family group down towards the mouth of Brooks River. This looks like number 482, Brett, and her 3 yearlings. So those are cubs in their 2nd year. I'm going to see if I can pull up, if I have a photo in the queue here of Brett from earlier this year. Actually, not from earlier this year. I do have a picture of her from several years ago to give you a better idea of what she looks like in July. She tends not to, her coat color in the fall tends not to get much darker than what we see here. But blonde, triangular shaped ears, one of the ways that I happen to identify this bear. Her cubs at this time of the year are darker than they were last year. Last year in particular, she had one cub that was very, very blonde. And actually it is. I think it's still quite blonde, but it's often been very wet. And, their fur tends just to look a little bit darker at this time of the year. But Brett is an experienced mother. She's had several litters. This is her litter last year. You can see just a section of the old floating bridge that has been replaced this year at the bottom of the screen. But that blonde cub that's standing upright in the photograph is also in Fat Bear Week. So you can compare and contrast later this week its July size with its fall size right now. It's one of those bears that has grown significantly over the past several months. And spring cubs, yearlings, they have the fastest growth rate of any class of bears. A spring cub that we see now is only 9 months old, but when it was born, it was only about a pound, and really not much bigger than a can of soup that you might have in your pantry. So, or a can of tomatoes. So if you're wondering how big is a bear cub when it's born, just go to your pantry, pull out a can of diced tomatoes or whatever that weighs about a pound, and that's about what a bear cub weighs when it's born. When spring cubs go into the dens coming up here in a month or so, they will be between 60 and 70 pounds on average. So they grow a tremendous amount. Yearlings can grow quite large at this time of the throughout their 2nd year too. They grow taller, they grow longer, they gain body mass at the same time, and they could be over. Some of the big yearlings can certainly be over 200 pounds at this time of the year. Now that's a really big yearling. Typically they don't get that large, so I should clarify on my statement. So, but yeah, it would not be uncommon to have, 150-pound yearling at this time of the year. So proportionally, as you're considering your Fat Bear Week votes, does that for that blonde yearling for 4A2 gain your vote or garner your vote because it has grown so much? Proportionally, it has gained probably more weight than any other bear in the Fat Bear Week bracket. So that's just something for you to consider moving forward when we begin the Fat Bear Week tournament on Wednesday. These cubs right here, this is probably their last summer with mother. So they, are sponges for information. They look to mom for guidance. She shows them, takes them to areas where they can find food. The cubs and yearlings are very curious about anything that mother happens to be curious about. So if they see mother grazing on something, they'll go over and they'll investigate that. If they see her pick up something out of the bottom of the river, they'll go over and investigate that. They are highly already highly dependent on salmon. Most of their calories are coming from salmon. And that was actually a question that came up in the Bear Cam question form earlier. Uh, Somebody was wondering how old are cubs when they start to eat salmon. Clearly, by their second year, I mean they're surviving mostly on salmon. But bear cubs will start to eat wild foods within a couple of months of coming out of the den during their first summer. So the spring cubs that we saw in July, they'll start to munch on salmon at that time of the year. Although mother's milk is still their most important food in early summer for those first year cubs. Yearlings will still nurse, so milk is still an important part of their diet. But these bears become nutritionally independent really by midsummer of their first year. So they could survive on completely wild food without their mother's, milk, by the time they happen to be 8 months old or so. Whether or not these yearlings return to the river is another question that we don't really know the answer to until we see them again. Brown bears often, especially males, often disperse away from their mother's home range. Females tend to be more homebodies, and their home range often overlaps with their mother. And of course, there is exceptions to all of this, so it's not a hard and fast rule for all bears. But as a general rule of thumb, if you're a young, independent, subadult male, you're more likely to sort of leave and, uh, and fuel your wanderlust by going elsewhere. And females are more likely to kind of stay closer to home. But if we do see some young independent bears, very small bears, wandering around the river next year, it could be some of 4A2's litter. We might have another family group come into view. This is at the spit looking out towards the mouth of Naknek River in Naknek Lake. So somebody actually was wondering, is the water that we're seeing on the cameras fresh or salty? Again, if you're not familiar with this location, Brooks River is about 60 water miles from the ocean. So this is entirely fresh water that we're seeing here. Although it can look quite like an ocean on windy days, like especially like some of the ones that we experienced yesterday. our bears are, at Brooks River, we see them behave as very social animals. Brown bears are often described as asocial, where they generally live solitary lives, and for the most part, that is true, especially in populations where there is not a high density of brown bears. Katmai National Park is about 4 million acres in size or so, and it is thought to have about 2,200 bears living wholly or partly within its boundaries, and that's more brown bears than all of the grizzlies in the lower 48. So that gives you an indication of perhaps how many, just how rich this ecosystem is. And bears certainly have social adaptations that allow them to interact with one another and generally avoid fights. We also see bears quite often enjoying the company of each other, playing with one another. Not with all bears, but it seems like certain bears will seek out others and be very playful with one another. And that happens, of course, in family groups. Mothers will often play with their cubs. Cubs will often play with one another. And I'm not quite able to identify who this or which family group this might be. Maybe they'll come a little bit closer into view. This looks like a smaller adult female, maybe with a couple of spring cubs, but it is difficult. Yeah, I think so. I think this maybe, I'm not, again, 100% sure on this. This might be number 708, Amelia, and her 2 spring cubs. She has one very dark spring cub. And this is an example of how bears are, curious by nature. That is either a park or lodge owned boat sitting there on the edge of the lake. And while at Brooks Camp, you can't leave anything unattended except basically motorboats and planes. Everything else has to be secured inside of a building. That doesn't mean bears don't investigate the boats. They do that frequently from time to time. Sometimes people might take the boats elsewhere in the park to go fishing. If you get a little bit of fish slime on your hands, you wipe it on the boat, that's going to attract the bear. The fuel in the boats, the gasoline, is also an attractant to brown bears and bears in general. So it's not uncommon, sometimes for hikers, not in Katmai, thankfully, but other places in the world, to lose their fuel canisters to bears. You think, hey, why would a bear, munch on my white gas that I'm taking hiking with me? It just smells very interesting to them. They often roll in it. When fuel has been spilled on the ground at Brooks River, we'll see bears kind of roll in it like a dog kind of rolls in a place that happens to be smelly. So again, they can express their curiosity in a lot of different ways, and they really sort of investigate the world through their noses, through their sense of, through their sense of smell, and also their sense of touch too. They love to investigate things with their claws and their paws, and since they are such large and powerful animals, they often end up, something when they investigate our objects, they do it in a destructive manner, and that's why preventing bears from damaging our property is the most effective way to keep bears, quote unquote, out of trouble. So if you're visiting Brooks Camp in the future, just keep that in mind. When you go there, make sure that you keep all of your property within arm's reach when you're out walking around. That way, if you are surprised by a bear, you don't have to leave anything behind. And bears don't learn to associate us with play toys. Because if they do find fun things for us to play with, they may be more likely to try to get those things from us in the future. And for the most part, bears at Brooks River are really just focused on finding fish. So it works, the system works fairly well, but the rules that are in place at Brooks Camp aren't necessarily to protect people. They're really, more than anything, there to protect brown bears. Over the next few weeks, I think we can still expect to enjoy views of brown bears from Brooks Falls. The Brooks Falls camera will remain online as long as the sun cooperates. Brooks Falls and the Riffles camera systems are powered by solar energy. So as long as that signal can get to Dumpling Mountain, then I think we can expect to enjoy bears and salmon at Brooks Falls for another few weeks or so. However, we can expect the lower river cameras to be turned off fairly soon. So I invite you and encourage you to watch the lower river cameras throughout the rest of the day. We could, as those generators get shut off, which may happen later today or tomorrow, we may lose these views. But, again, we're still going to have the opportunity to watch brown bears at the river as long as solar energy cooperates for the falls and riffles. A golden view today, looking towards Brooks Lodge and Dumpling Mountain on one of our lower river cameras. A beautiful bear family, it looks like, at the river mouth. And I think I'm going to retract my statement on this being Amelia and her cubs. This does not look like them. So it could be just a gang of subadult bears, but I am not entirely sure. Anyway, you can debate that in the comments as much as you want to. I think this might be a good time to conclude this play-by-play style broadcast today. I would like to thank everybody for joining me on the broadcast, being patient with my sound issues that I had at the beginning of the broadcast. I'll be back online later this week with Ranger Naomi on Wednesday, October 2nd at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, to discuss Fat Bear Week. We know that bears get fat to survive, and Fat Bear Week is a celebration of their ample proportions. And of course, it's a celebration of Katmai's healthy and robust ecosystem. So Naomi and I, during that live chat, will discuss and introduce the contestants in this year's Fat Bear Week tournament. We'll talk a lot about their life story. So I hope you join us for that broadcast and all of our other live events that we have coming up on explore.org and especially on the explore.org bear cams. So thanks again to all of you at home who listened and enjoyed the broadcast. Thanks to my wonderful camera operators who gave us these great views of the bears today. My name is Mike Fitz with explore.org. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.